The imperial palace of Zenthar gleamed under three suns, its crystalline towers reaching toward the purple sky like fingers grasping at infinity. Princess Charlotte of Earth stood at the grand observation deck, her human frame small compared to the towering alien dignitaries who surrounded her. She wore the formal diplomatic robes of the Terran Federation, simple compared to the elaborate garments of the other species. Yet there was something about her presence that commanded attention. Her brown eyes took in everything, calculating, and observant in a way that made some of the older ambassadors uncomfortable. The Galactic Council had been in session for 3 cycles now, and Charlotte had represented humanity with quiet dignity. At 23 years old, she was the youngest princess ever sent on such a critical mission. The other species whispered about it in their various languages and telepathic frequencies. Some thought humanity was mocking the council by sending someone so young. Others believed the humans simply had no better candidates. None of them understood that Charlotte had been trained since birth for exactly this moment, and that humanity never did anything without careful calculation. The treaty negotiations were delicate. Earth wanted full membership in the Galactic Council, but many of the elder species objected. Humans were too aggressive, too unpredictable, too dangerous. They had gone from primitive tribal warfare to splitting the atom in mere thousands of years. They had nearly destroyed themselves multiple times. Now they wanted a seat at the table where decisions affecting trillions of beings were made. The Zelnari delegation had been particularly vocal in their opposition, citing humanity's violent history and emotional instability. Charlotte had listened to all the arguments against her species with patience that surprised even her own advisors. She never raised her voice, never showed anger, never displayed the supposed emotional weakness that the aliens expected. Instead, she presented data, shared cultural insights, and spoke about humanity's capacity for growth and change. Some delegates began to soften their positions. The vote was scheduled for the next cycle, and preliminary counts suggested it would be close. During a recess, Charlotte decided to take a walk through the palace gardens. Her security detail, a mix of human soldiers and local Zenthari guards, maintained a respectful distance. She needed to think, to process the weight of what was coming. Tomorrow's vote would determine whether humanity stepped into the galactic community as equals or remained isolated on the outer rim, always viewed as dangerous children playing with weapons they didn't fully understand. The gardens were magnificent, filled with plants from 1,000 worlds. Bioluminescent flowers from Keftar glowed softly beside crystalline trees from Vornis Prime. The air itself seemed to shimmer with carefully controlled environmental systems that allowed incompatible atmospheres to exist in separate bubbles. Charlotte paused beside a fountain that flowed upward, defying gravity through technology humanity was only beginning to comprehend. That was when she heard it. A sharp voice, speaking in Galactic Common, the universal trade language. The tone was aggressive, dismissive, cruel. Charlotte's translator earpiece processed the words instantly and her jaw tightened. She moved quietly toward the source of the disturbance, her diplomatic training warring with a more primal instinct that every human carried in their bones. Around a corner formed by hedge-like organisms from Zenthar's northern continent, she found the scene. A palace guard, one of the local Zenth species, stood rigidly at attention. His forearms were locked at his sides, his compound eyes fixed straight ahead. The Zenth were an insectoid species, standing nearly 3 meters tall when fully upright, with chitinous exoskeletons that shimmered in shades of deep blue and green. This particular guard was young. Charlotte could tell by the lighter coloring of his carapace. Confronting him was Ambassador Threll of the Zelnari hegemony. The Zelnari were one of the oldest species in the Council, having achieved spaceflight when humanity's ancestors were still learning to control fire. Threll himself was nearly 500 years old, his scaled skin bearing the ceremonial scars of dozens of diplomatic campaigns. He stood before the guard, his serpentine body coiled in a posture of dominance, and he was berating the young Zenth mercilessly. The translator caught fragments of the tirade. Incompetent, worthless, a disgrace to your hive. The words were harsh, but what struck Charlotte most was the physical intimidation. Threll was using his bulk to crowd the guard, who could not move from his post without abandoning his duty. The young Zenth was trapped between his orders, and the abuse being heaped upon him by someone technically his superior in the diplomatic hierarchy. Charlotte's security detail had caught up to her, and her lead guard, Captain Morrison, touched her shoulder gently. The human's expression was carefully neutral, but Charlotte could read the concern there. This was not her concern. This was internal palace business. Getting involved could jeopardize everything they had worked for. The vote was tomorrow. Antagonizing Threll, who led the opposition faction, could doom humanity's application for council membership. All of this flashed through Charlotte's mind in an instant. The diplomatic calculations, the political ramifications, the careful balance of power she had been maintaining for 3 cycles. Her advisors would tell her to walk away. Her mission commanders would order her to ignore it. The rational, logical choice was clear. But Charlotte was human, and humans had never been particularly good at making the rational choice when faced with injustice. Something in their evolutionary psychology, forged in millions of years of tribal loyalty and pack bonding, made them react to bullying and cruelty in ways that transcended logic. It was one of the things that made them dangerous. It was also one of the things that made them remarkable. She stepped forward, her boots making soft sounds on the crystalline pathway. Ambassador Threll was in the middle of another cutting remark when he noticed her approach. His vertical pupils dilated slightly, processing her presence. Behind him, the young Zenth guard's compound eyes flickered in her direction, though he maintained his rigid posture. Charlotte stopped a respectful distance away, her hands clasped loosely before her. She smiled, but it was the smile of a predator showing teeth, the kind of expression that had made prey animals on Earth instinctively flee for millions of years. When she spoke, her voice was calm, pleasant even, but carrying an undertone that made Captain Morrison tense and reach instinctively for his sidearm. The confrontation that was about to unfold would change everything, not just for Charlotte, not just for the treaty negotiations, but for how the Galactic Council understood what it truly meant to be human. They were about to learn that humanity's greatest strength and their most terrifying quality were one and the same. When humans saw injustice, when they witnessed the strong preying upon the weak, something ancient and primal activated in their psychology. They simply could not walk away. Ambassador Threll turned his full attention to Charlotte, his scaled head tilting in what might have been curiosity or contempt. Up close, the Zelnari was even more imposing, his body easily 4 meters in length when fully extended, with musculature that spoke of a predator species that had climbed to the top of their world's food chain, long before developing sentience. His ceremonial robes were adorned with crystals that marked his status, each one representing a world that had pledged allegiance to the Zelnari hegemony. The Princess of Earth met his gaze without flinching. It was a small thing but significant. Most species found it difficult to maintain eye contact with a Zelnari, some ancient survival instinct warning them that they were looking at something dangerous. Humans, it seemed, had different instincts, or perhaps they simply ignored them more readily. Threll's forked tongue flickered out, tasting the air, reading pheromones and chemical signals. He spoke in Galactic Common, his voice a sibilant hiss that the translator rendered into precise cold words. He expressed surprise at seeing Princess Charlotte away from the formal proceedings. He suggested with venomous politeness that the gardens might be dangerous for one so young and inexperienced. He implied that she should return to her quarters, perhaps rest before the important vote tomorrow. Charlotte maintained her smile, though anyone who knew humans well would have recognized it as anything but friendly. She thanked the ambassador for his concern, her tone matching his own false courtesy. Then she turned her attention to the young Zenth guard, addressing him directly in his native language. She had spent weeks learning it, studying the complex clicking and chirping sounds that the Zenth used among themselves. Her pronunciation was imperfect, marked by the limitations of a human vocal apparatus, but the meaning was clear. She asked if the guard was well. She inquired about his duty station and how long he had been assigned to the palace. Simple questions, the kind one might ask any worker one encountered, but by speaking to him at all, by acknowledging him as a person worthy of conversation, she was making a statement. The young Zenth's compound eyes widened fractionally, processing this unexpected development. Threll's scaled skin darkened, a visible sign of agitation in his species. He interrupted. pointing out that the guard was on duty and could not engage in casual conversation. He suggested more forcefully now that Princess Charlotte was overstepping her bounds. The palace staff were not her concern. She should focus on her own delegation's affairs and leave internal matters to those who understood the protocols. Charlotte turned back to him, and this time there was no smile. Her brown eyes held something that made even the ancient diplomat pause. It was a look that Threll had seen before, in the eyes of soldiers and warriors across 100 species, but never from a human. He had heard stories about human combat capabilities, their berserker rages and tactical brilliance, but he had dismissed them as exaggeration. Looking at Charlotte now, he began to reconsider. The princess spoke clearly, her words chosen with precision. She noted that she had observed the ambassador's interaction with the guard. She remarked that in human culture, there were certain behaviors considered beneath the dignity of those who held power. She explained that where she came from, the measure of a person was found not in how they treated their equals, but in how they treated those who could not defend themselves. Her tone remained polite, but the accusation was unmistakable. Threll drew himself up to his full height, coiling his body in a threat display that had intimidated countless beings over his centuries of diplomatic service. He declared that the human princess had no right to question him. He was an ambassador of the Zelnari hegemony, a civilization that had mastered the stars when her species was still living in caves. He would not be lectured on proper behavior by a representative of a species that had not yet proven itself worthy of basic council membership. The confrontation had attracted attention. Other beings began to gather at a distance, drawn by the raised voices and the unmistakable tension in the air. Charlotte's security detail moved closer, their hands near their weapons, but the princess raised a hand to stop them. Captain Morrison looked torn between his duty to protect her and his awareness that any violence would destroy everything they had worked for. Charlotte addressed Threll again, her voice still calm but carrying an edge that made the translator struggle to properly convey the nuance. She acknowledged his species' achievements and his personal experience. She conceded that humanity was young by galactic standards, but she made it clear that youth did not equate to ignorance, and being new to the stars did not mean humans lacked understanding of right and wrong. She stated with absolute conviction that no amount of age or advancement justified cruelty, and that the hallmark of true civilization was not technology or longevity, but compassion and justice. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Several of the gathered aliens murmured among themselves, their various means of communication creating a strange symphony of sound. Some seemed shocked by Charlotte's audacity. Others appeared intrigued. A few of the younger delegates looked at the human princess with something approaching admiration. Threll's response was swift and cutting. He laughed, a sound like grinding stones, and declared that this was exactly why humans were not ready for the council. They were too emotional, too quick to involve themselves in matters that did not concern them. They saw injustice everywhere because they projected their own violent history onto others. He suggested that Charlotte's outburst proved everything the opposition had been saying about human instability. The ambassador then made a critical error. He turned back to the young Zenth guard and, perhaps emboldened by having an audience, perhaps angry at being challenged by someone he considered beneath him, he struck the guard across the thorax with his tail. It was not a severe blow, not enough to cause serious injury to a being with an exoskeleton, but it was unmistakably an assault. The crack of scales against chitin echoed through the garden. The young Zenth remained at attention, but Charlotte saw the slight tremor that ran through his body. She saw the way his mandibles tightened. She recognized the posture of someone enduring abuse because they had no choice, because speaking out would cost them everything. It was a posture she had seen in her studies of Earth's history, in images of the oppressed and the powerless across countless human societies. It was a sight that had always triggered something deep in the human psyche, something that had driven revolutionaries and reformers, something that had toppled empires and broken chains. Charlotte moved before conscious thought caught up with her actions. It was pure instinct, the same instinct that had made humans defend pack members, the same impulse that had made them stand against predators twice their size, the same drive that had pushed them to fight impossible odds throughout their violent history. She stepped between Threll and the guard, placing her small human body directly in the ambassador's path. Captain Morrison cursed under his breath, knowing that everything was about to change. The other security personnel tensed, preparing for whatever came next. The gathered aliens fell silent, shocked by the humans' audacity, and Ambassador Threll stared down at Princess Charlotte with undisguised fury, his vertical pupils contracting to slits. Charlotte looked up at the massive alien, her neck craned back to meet his eyes. She was a fraction of his size, her species barely out of their own solar system compared to his ancient civilization. By every logical measure, she should have been terrified. Instead, she stood her ground with the same determination that had allowed humans to survive ice ages and plagues, to cross oceans in wooden boats and eventually reach for the stars themselves. When she spoke, her words would resonate far beyond the palace gardens, carried by witnesses to every corner of the Galactic Council. Charlotte spoke with a voice that carried across the garden, clear and unwavering despite the dangerous predator looming over her. She told Ambassador Threll that his actions were unacceptable, not just by human standards but by the very principles the Galactic Council claimed to uphold. She pointed out that the Council's founding charter spoke of justice, dignity, and the rights of all sentient beings. She asked how those lofty ideals meant anything if someone of his status could strike a guard with impunity simply because he was having a bad day. Threll's body coiled tighter, his scales darkening to an almost black color. He informed Charlotte that she had just made a catastrophic mistake. He stated that her interference in matters that did not concern her, her disrespect toward a senior ambassador, and her general presumption would be reported to the full council. He promised that when the vote came tomorrow, humanity would not only be rejected for membership, but they would be formally censured. Earth would be lucky if they were not restricted from even minor trade agreements. The princess did not retreat. Instead, she took a step forward, closing the distance between herself and the massive alien. The movement was so unexpected, so contrary to proper diplomatic protocol and basic survival instinct, that several witnesses later reported believing they were about to watch a human die. Threll could have killed her easily, with a simple strike or by simply coiling around her smaller body. Galactic law gave diplomats certain protections, but there were always ways to claim accidents or self-defense. Charlotte looked up at him and said something that no one expected. She thanked him. She expressed genuine gratitude for what he had just done. The gathered crowd stirred with confusion, and even Threll seemed momentarily taken aback. His forked tongue flickered out, tasting the air for signs of fear or deception, finding neither. She explained herself with perfect clarity. She noted that for 3 cycles, the opposition to human membership had argued that humanity was too emotional, too unpredictable, too prone to violence and instability. They had presented data and historical records, all painting a picture of a dangerous species that could not be trusted with council membership. And Charlotte had countered with her own data, her own arguments, trying to present humanity in the most rational and diplomatic light possible. But Threll had just given her something far more valuable than data. He had provided a demonstration, witnessed by representatives from dozens of species, of exactly what humanity stood for and against. He had shown everyone present the difference between humans and the supposedly superior elder races. When faced with injustice, with cruelty inflicted on someone powerless to defend themselves, humanity did not calculate political costs or consider diplomatic ramifications. They simply acted. They stood up. They put themselves at risk for someone they barely knew, from a species they had only just encountered. Charlotte addressed the crowd that had gathered, her voice ringing with conviction. She acknowledged that yes, humans were emotional. Yes, they sometimes acted without fully considering consequences. Yes, they had a violent history filled with terrible mistakes and regrettable actions. But those same qualities meant that humans could not stand by and watch injustice occur. They could not witness cruelty and remain silent. They could not calculate the political cost of doing the right thing, and then choose not to act because the price was too high. She pointed out that Ambassador Threll, representative of a civilization thousands of years old, had just struck someone who could not defend themselves because he was annoyed. Meanwhile, she, representative of a species barely 200 years into space exploration, had instinctively moved to protect that same person, despite knowing it would probably cost her everything she had worked for. She asked the gathered aliens a simple question: which species truly demonstrated the values the Galactic Council claimed to hold dear? The silence that followed was profound. Some of the witnesses looked uncomfortable. their various means of expressing emotion showing clear signs of cognitive dissonance. Others appeared thoughtful, as if Charlotte's words had struck a chord they had not expected. A few, particularly among the younger delegates, showed something approaching approval. Threll recovered from his surprise with visible effort. He declared that Charlotte's speech was nothing but manipulation, an attempt to turn her own misconduct into some kind of virtue. He pointed out that she had violated diplomatic protocol, interfered in internal palace affairs, and now she was trying to use rhetoric to justify her actions. He insisted that this proved exactly what the opposition had been saying. Humans could not follow rules, could not control their impulses, and would cause chaos wherever they went. But before he could continue, a new voice entered the conversation. The young Zenth guard, who had remained silent and still throughout the entire confrontation, spoke. His words were in his native language, the clicks and chirps rapid and agitated. Charlotte's translator rendered them into galactic common, and what the guard said sent ripples through the assembled crowd. He stated that Ambassador Threll had been harassing him for cycles, ever since the guard had been assigned to this section of the palace. The ambassador frequently found fault with his posture, his uniform, his very presence. The abuse had escalated, becoming more personal and more physical. The young Zenth had reported it to his superiors, but nothing had been done. Threll was an important diplomat, and the guard was easily replaceable. The system protected those with power and ignored those without it. The guard's supervisor, a more senior Zenth who had arrived during the confrontation, made a gesture of extreme agitation. He tried to silence the younger guard, clicking furiously that speaking out of turn was a violation of duty protocols. But the young Zenth continued, his voice growing stronger. He stated that he had endured the abuse because he thought he had no choice, because this was simply how things worked in the palace, in the council, in the broader galaxy. But Princess Charlotte had shown him something different. He explained that when the human had stepped between him and Threll, she had not asked his permission. She had not calculated whether he was worth defending. She had not considered what species he was or what his status might be. She had simply seen someone being harmed and acted to stop it. In that moment, the young guard realized that the abuse he had been enduring was not normal, not acceptable, and not something he had to tolerate silently. The crowd's murmuring grew louder. Several delegates began heated discussions with their companions. Charlotte's own security team looked torn between pride and horror at the situation that was unfolding. Captain Morrison had his hand pressed to his ear, clearly receiving urgent communications from the Earth delegation leadership, none of which he looked happy about. Ambassador Threll's scales had darkened to the point where they seemed to absorb light. He declared that this was an outrage, that the guard would be dismissed immediately for insubordination, and that he would personally see to it that both the Zenth and Princess Charlotte faced severe consequences. He began to turn away, clearly intending to escalate the matter to the highest levels of authority. Charlotte called after him, her voice sharp enough to make him pause. She informed him that she had been recording the entire interaction. Her diplomatic suite included various monitoring technologies, standard equipment for Earth ambassadors operating in environments where human legal protections did not apply. She had video, audio, and sensor data showing exactly what had transpired, including the moment Threll had struck the guard. Furthermore, she noted that the gathering crowd meant there were now dozens of witnesses from multiple species. Some of them were undoubtedly recording as well, as was common practice in diplomatic circles where verbal agreements and observed behaviors carried significant weight. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences fell on her or the guard, the truth of this incident would spread throughout the council. Everyone would know that Ambassador Threll of the Zelnari hegemony had been caught abusing a palace guard and had then been confronted by a human princess who had demonstrated more integrity in 3 minutes than he had, shown in 500 years. The threat was clear and devastating. In galactic politics, reputation was everything. The Zelnari hegemony had built their influence on claims of cultural superiority and enlightened governance. Having one of their senior ambassadors exposed as a petty bully would damage that reputation severely. Other species who had been considering alignment with the Zelnari might reconsider. Worlds within their sphere of influence might question whether their overlords truly embodied the ideals they proclaimed. Threll stood frozen, His serpentine body coiled in a posture that spoke of barely contained rage. His vertical pupils contracted until they were mere slits, and his forked tongue flickered rapidly as he processed the situation. Charlotte had outmaneuvered him completely. In trying to intimidate her into silence, he had instead given her exactly the ammunition she needed. The recordings would spread throughout diplomatic channels within hours. By the time the vote occurred tomorrow, every delegate would have seen the incident and formed their own conclusions. The ambassador's next words were carefully measured, spoken through what humans would recognize as gritted teeth. He suggested that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding, that cultural differences sometimes led to misinterpretations of behavior. He noted that what might appear as aggression in one species could be normal interaction in another. He proposed that they could discuss this matter privately, perhaps reach some accommodation that would satisfy all parties involved. Charlotte recognized the offer for what it was: damage control. Threll was trying to contain the situation before it spiraled beyond his ability to manage. Under normal circumstances, a junior diplomat would have accepted such an olive branch from a senior ambassador, especially one representing such a powerful faction. It was the reasonable thing to do, the political thing to do. But Charlotte had already decided that she was done being reasonable in the face of injustice. She declined his offer with polite firmness. She stated that this was not a matter for private discussion or quiet resolution. The young guard had been wronged, and that wrong needed to be acknowledged publicly. Moreover, the incident raised larger questions about how the Galactic Council truly functioned, whether the ideals written in their charters had any real meaning, or if they were simply pleasant words that applied only when convenient. One of the gathered delegates, a Calorian whose species was known for their legal expertise, spoke up. The Calorian's translated words suggested that Princess Charlotte was correct in her assessment. Council law explicitly prohibited physical assault, especially against those performing official duties. The fact that the victim was a palace guard made it even more serious, as it represented an attack on the authority of the Xanthari government itself. By all proper procedures, the matter should be reported to council security and formally investigated. Another voice joined in. This time a delegate from the Maranu Collective, a species known for their emphasis on social harmony and collective well-being. The Maranu representative noted that they had observed several incidents over the cycles where more powerful beings had mistreated those in service positions. They had remained silent because it seemed to be accepted practice, and the Maranu were a relatively minor member of the council who could not afford to offend major powers. But if humans were willing to speak out against such behavior, perhaps it was time for others to do the same. The floodgates had opened. More delegates began sharing their own observations, their own experiences of witnessing or even enduring mistreatment from those higher in the diplomatic hierarchy. The young Xanth guard stood at his post, his compound eyes moving between speakers, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden attention and support. His supervisor had fallen silent, apparently uncertain how to proceed in this unprecedented situation. Threll realized he was losing control of the narrative. He attempted to regain the initiative by pointing out that Princess Charlotte had still violated protocol by interfering in palace business. Regardless of his actions, which he continued to characterize as a misunderstanding, she had overstepped her authority as a visiting diplomat. He suggested that both parties had behaved inappropriately and should both face consequences. Charlotte agreed with him, to everyone's surprise. She stated clearly that yes, she had violated diplomatic protocol. She had interfered in matters that were technically not her concern. By the strict letter of council law, she had overreached her authority. She was willing to accept whatever consequences came from those actions. She would submit to official censure, accept penalties, even support a recommendation that Earth's application for membership be denied if the council felt her behavior disqualified her species. But she would do all of that only after the council also held Ambassador Threll accountable for his actions. If they wanted to punish her for defending someone, then they needed to equally punish him for attacking that same person. If the council believed that maintaining diplomatic protocol was more important than preventing abuse, then they should state that clearly in their ruling, so that everyone understood what values actually mattered in galactic society. The challenge was brilliant in its simplicity. Charlotte had framed the situation in terms that made it impossible for the council to avoid confronting their own hypocrisy. They could not punish her without also punishing Threll, because doing so would explicitly state that protecting abusers was more important than protecting victims. They could not ignore both incidents because too many witnesses had seen what happened, and they could not punish only Threll, because that would validate Charlotte's actions and undermine the very arguments being used against human membership. Captain Morrison watched his princess with a mixture of awe and concern. He had served under Charlotte for 2 years, and he had seen her navigate complex diplomatic situations with skill beyond her years. But this was different. She had gone beyond diplomacy into something more fundamental, more dangerous. She was forcing the Galactic Council to confront truths about themselves that they had been comfortable ignoring. It was either brilliant or suicidal, and Morrison suspected it might be both. The senior Zenth supervisor, who had been trying to quiet the young guard earlier, suddenly spoke up in his species' clicking language. His words were translated to acknowledge that there had been multiple complaints about Ambassador Threll's behavior toward palace staff. The supervisor admitted that these complaints had been suppressed because Threll's diplomatic status made him essentially untouchable. The Zenthari government valued their relationship with the Selnari hegemony and did not want to cause friction over what were considered minor personnel issues. This admission caused another wave of reaction through the crowd. A Korvax delegate, whose species prided themselves on personal honor, stated loudly that suppressing legitimate complaints was itself a violation of council principles. If junior staff members could not report abuse without fear of retaliation, then the entire system was corrupt. The Korvax suggested that this matter needed to be brought before the full council immediately, not buried in private negotiations. Threll's scales had lightened slightly, moving from black to a dark gray that suggested his emotional state was shifting from rage to something more calculating. He was reassessing the situation, recognizing that his initial approach had failed. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. He proposed that perhaps this incident could serve as a learning opportunity for the council. Issues of power imbalance and proper treatment of service personnel had been overlooked for too long. Maybe it was time to establish clearer guidelines and oversight mechanisms. It was a masterful pivot, attempting to turn his exposure as an abuser into an opportunity to appear reform-minded. Charlotte recognized the tactic immediately. Threll was trying to control the damage by becoming part of the solution, by framing himself as someone who could learn and grow, rather than as someone who needed to be punished. It was exactly the kind of political maneuvering that had allowed powerful figures throughout history to escape consequences for their actions. Charlotte did not let him off that easily. She pointed out that guidelines and oversight mechanisms already existed in council law. The problem was not a lack of rules, but a lack of enforcement. What good were principles if they only applied to those without power or influence? She noted that Threll's sudden interest in reform only emerged after he was caught and exposed. True reform would require actual consequences for those who violated the rules, not just promises to do better in the future. Her words struck at something fundamental in galactic politics. For thousands of years, the Council had operated on a system where power and status provided immunity from accountability. The elder species, those who had been members longest and had built the most influence, could act with relative impunity as long as they maintained a veneer of civilized behavior. Younger species and those in service positions had learned to accept this as the price of participation in galactic society. Humans, with their short history and lack of established status, had no investment in maintaining this system. Charlotte was free to attack it in ways that other species could not or would not. Some of the gathered delegates were beginning to realize that admitting humanity to the Council might fundamentally change how it operated. The question was whether that change would be seen as threatening or necessary. The crowd in the garden had swelled to include nearly 50 beings from 24 species. What had started as a private confrontation had become a very public spectacle, and news of the incident was spreading rapidly through the palace communication networks. Charlotte's personal communicator had been buzzing constantly for the past several minutes. No doubt urgent messages from the Earth delegation leadership, demanding to know what was happening. She ignored it, keeping her attention focused on the situation unfolding before her. A new figure emerged from the crowd, and Charlotte recognized her immediately. Ambassador Silith of the Kalorn Assembly, one of the most respected neutral parties on the council. The Kalorn were an ancient species like the Zelnari, but they had built their reputation on fairness and measured judgment rather than military or economic dominance. Silith's species resembled crystalline humanoids, their bodies formed from living mineral that reflected light in constantly shifting patterns. When she spoke, her voice had a musical quality that the translator rendered into words that seemed to carry extra weight. Silith addressed the assembled group, noting that she had been walking in the gardens when she heard the commotion. She had arrived in time to witness the latter portion of the confrontation, including Ambassador Threll's strike against the guard and Princess Charlotte's intervention. As someone who had served on the council for over 300 years, she felt compelled to offer her perspective on what she had observed. The Kalorn ambassador stated plainly that Threll's actions had violated council law and basic ethical standards. There was no ambiguity in her assessment, no diplomatic hedging. She then turned her attention to Charlotte, and the human princess steeled herself for criticism of her own protocol violations. But Silith's words surprised her. The Kalorn acknowledged that Charlotte had technically exceeded her authority by interfering in palace affairs. However, Silith pointed out that the council's founding charter included specific provisions about the duty to intervene when witnessing severe violations of law or ethics, even if such intervention meant temporarily overstepping normal boundaries. This provision had been written by the founding species specifically to prevent powerful members from abusing their status with impunity. It had rarely been invoked in recent centuries, largely because most beings were reluctant to risk their political standing by challenging their superiors. Princess Charlotte, Silith noted, had done exactly what the founding charter envisioned. She had seen a wrong being committed, and she had acted to stop it despite the personal and political cost. The fact that she was willing to accept consequences for her actions demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity and courage that the council was meant to embody. Silith stated that in her 3 centuries of service, she had seen countless examples of beings looking the other way when witnessing injustice because intervention would be inconvenient or politically costly. The human's willingness to risk everything for a guard she had never met spoke volumes about her character and perhaps about humanity as a whole. The Kalorn ambassador then made a formal declaration. She would be bringing this matter before the full council at the earliest opportunity, not as a minor incident to be quietly resolved, but as a test case for whether the council's stated values had any real meaning. She would be calling for a full investigation into Ambassador Threll's conduct and into the broader pattern of abuse that appeared to exist within the palace staff system. She would also be proposing reforms to ensure that service personnel had genuine recourse when facing mistreatment from those in power. Threll attempted to object, claiming that Silith was overreacting and turning a simple misunderstanding into a crisis. But the Kalorn's crystalline features hardened, the light refracting through her body taking on sharper angles. She informed Threll that she had suspected for years that he was abusing his position, but she had lacked concrete evidence and witnesses willing to come forward. Now she had both, thanks to Princess Charlotte's intervention and the young guard's courage in speaking out. The investigation would proceed regardless of Threll's objections. Charlotte felt the weight of the moment settling over her. She had achieved what she wanted in terms of holding Threll accountable, but she also recognized that the political fallout was going to be severe. The Zelnari hegemony would see this as a humiliation, and they would almost certainly retaliate by ensuring Earth's membership application was rejected. She had traded humanity's place in the Galactic Council for one guard's dignity. Many would say it was a foolish exchange, that she had let emotion override reason, that she had proven exactly what the opposition claimed about human instability. But as Charlotte looked at the young Zenth guard, at the way his posture had changed from rigid fear to something approaching hope, she found that she did not regret her choice. There were some things more important than political advancement, some principles that could not be compromised for convenience. If humanity was going to join the galactic community, it would do so on terms that reflected human values, not by abandoning those values for acceptance. Captain Morrison finally spoke quietly into her ear, informing her that Ambassador Chen, the head of Earth's delegation, was demanding her immediate return to their quarters. There would be consequences for what she had done, official reprimands at minimum, possibly even recall to Earth in disgrace. Charlotte nodded her understanding but did not move. She had started this, and she would see it through to the end. The crowd began to disperse slowly, with delegates breaking into small groups to discuss what they had witnessed. Some appeared supportive of Charlotte's actions. Others seemed disturbed by the disruption to normal protocols, and a few looked calculatingly at the political opportunities this incident might create. The young Zenth Guard supervisor approached Charlotte hesitantly, his clicks and chirps conveying a mixture of gratitude and concern. He thanked her for intervening but warned that she had made powerful enemies. The Zelnari did not forget slights, and Threll in particular was known for holding grudges that lasted decades. Charlotte thanked him for the warning and then addressed the young guard directly. She asked his name, wanting to know the identity of the being she had potentially sacrificed her career to defend. The guard's translator rendered his response as a complex series of sounds that approximated to Kreshtel in Galactic Common. Charlotte repeated it carefully, committing it to memory. She told Kreshtel that what he had done today, speaking out despite the risks, required tremendous courage. She hoped that he would continue to show that courage in the days ahead, because the investigation would likely be difficult for him. Kreshtel's compound eyes met Charlotte's human gaze, and for a moment, two very different species connected on a fundamental level. He told her that before today he had believed that the powerful would always abuse the weak, that this was simply how the universe worked. But she had shown him something different. She had demonstrated that beings could choose to stand up for what was right even when it cost them dearly. He would remember that lesson for the rest of his life, regardless of what happened next. Ambassador Threll had remained in the garden, watching the exchanges with barely concealed fury. As Charlotte finally turned to leave, escorted by her security detail, he called out to her one final time. His words were cold and precise, a promise wrapped in diplomatic language. He informed her that her actions today would have consequences far beyond what she imagined. The vote tomorrow would be just the beginning. Earth would learn that there was a price for insulting elder species and disrupting the careful balance of council politics. Humanity's dream of joining the galactic community would die before it truly began, and it would be entirely Charlotte's fault. The human princess stopped and looked back at him. For a moment, Captain Morrison thought she might respond with anger or defiance. Instead, she smiled sadly and spoke words that would be quoted in diplomatic circles for years to come. She said that if humanity's membership required them to accept injustice silently, to ignore abuse because confronting it was politically inconvenient, to value status and protocol over basic decency, then perhaps they were not ready to join the council after all. Not because they lacked the maturity or wisdom, but because they refused to become the kind of species that thrived in such a system. She continued, noting that humans had a saying from their history, "We must always take sides." Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. If joining the Galactic Council meant learning to be silent in the face of cruelty, then humanity would rather remain isolated and alone but true to their principles. They had made that mistake before in their own history, staying silent while atrocities occurred because speaking out was too costly. They had sworn never to make that mistake again, regardless of the price. Charlotte walked away then, her security detail forming a protective barrier around her. Behind her, the garden had fallen completely silent. Even Threll seemed at a loss for words, confronted with a perspective that did not fit into his centuries of diplomatic experience. The young guard Kreshtel stood at his post, but his posture had changed entirely. He stood straighter now, his forearms held with a confidence that had been absent before. As Charlotte made her way back through the crystalline corridors of the palace, she passed other staff members, maintenance workers, and service personnel from various species. Word of what had happened had already spread among them, traveling through the informal networks that existed wherever beings of lower status gathered. Several of them stopped what they were doing to watch her pass. A few made gestures that her translator identified as signs of respect or gratitude in their respective cultures. One elderly cleaning worker, a species Charlotte did not immediately recognize, reached out to touch her arm gently as she passed, conveying something that transcended language barriers. By the time Charlotte reached the quarters assigned to the Earth delegation, a crowd of humans was waiting for her. Ambassador Chen stood at the front, his expression thunderous. The other diplomatic staff looked worried, scared even. They had all worked so hard for this opportunity, spent years preparing for Earth's application to the Council, and in a single afternoon, Charlotte had apparently destroyed everything. Ambassador Chen did not waste time with pleasantries. He demanded to know what Charlotte had been thinking, whether she understood the magnitude of what she had just done, if she had any comprehension of the political damage she had caused. His voice rose with each question, the frustration and anger of months of careful diplomatic work seemingly undone in minutes pouring out of him. The other staff members watched in uncomfortable silence, some looking at Charlotte with disappointment, others with something approaching sympathy. Charlotte let him speak until his anger was spent. She did not interrupt, did not try to defend herself or minimize what had happened. She simply stood there and took the verbal assault with the same calm she had shown when facing Ambassador Threll. When Chen finally ran out of words, breathing heavily from his outburst, she spoke quietly and clearly. She apologized for not consulting with him before acting. She acknowledged that her actions had violated protocol and potentially jeopardized their mission. She accepted full responsibility and offered to submit her resignation immediately if he believed that would help salvage the situation. But she also stated with absolute conviction that she would make the same choice again if faced with identical circumstances. Some things were more important than diplomatic success, and defending someone from abuse was one of them. Chen stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. It was not a happy sound, more the laugh of someone who had been pushed beyond the limits of normal emotional response and found himself in territory where conventional reactions no longer applied. He told Charlotte that she was either the bravest or most foolish person he had ever worked with, and he honestly could not decide which. The ambassador sat down heavily, suddenly looking much older than his 53 years. He explained that he had already been contacted by multiple council delegates. Some were calling for Charlotte's immediate expulsion from the palace. Others were demanding that Earth formally reprimand her and issue apologies to Ambassador Threll and the Zelnari hegemony. The Zelnari themselves had filed an official protest and were threatening to block any Earth proposals for the next decade if this insult was not addressed properly. The situation was, in diplomatic terms, a complete disaster, but Chen also noted something interesting. Several delegates who had previously been lukewarm or even opposed to human membership were now expressing private support for Charlotte's actions. The Maranu Collective had sent a message indicating they would be changing their vote to support humanity. The Korvax delegation was drafting a formal commendation for Charlotte's courage. Even some members of species aligned with the Zelnari were quietly reaching out to express admiration for what she had done. Though they could not say so publicly without risking their political relationships, Captain Morrison, who had been standing silently near the door, spoke up. He reported that his security team had intercepted multiple communications discussing the incident. The recordings Charlotte had made were already circulating through unofficial channels, and the response was mixed but significant. Many beings, especially those from younger council species or those in service positions, were expressing support for the human princess. There was talk of organizing a petition calling for reform of how palace staff were treated. Some delegates were even suggesting that this incident proved humans would be a valuable addition to the council, bringing a perspective that had been sorely lacking. One of the junior diplomats, a young woman named Sarah Martinez, timidly raised her hand. When Chen nodded at her, she pointed out that humanity's entire pitch for council membership had been based on the idea that they would bring fresh perspectives and challenge existing assumptions. They had argued that the council had become stagnant, too set in its ways, too comfortable with systems that no longer served their original purpose. Charlotte had just demonstrated exactly that quality in the most dramatic way possible. It was consistent with their stated values, even if the execution had been explosive. Chen considered this observation, his fingers drumming on the armrest of his chair. He admitted that Martinez had a point. Earth's strategy had been to position themselves as dynamic newcomers who could help the council evolve and adapt. The opposition had countered by painting humans as dangerous and unpredictable. Charlotte's actions fit both narratives perfectly. The question was which interpretation would dominate when the council voted tomorrow. The ambassador made a decision. He told Charlotte that she would not be resigning, apologizing or backing down from what she had done. If Earth was going to lose this vote, they would lose it while standing for their principles. He would draft a statement supporting Charlotte's actions, framing them as exactly the kind of moral courage that the council needed. It was a gamble, possibly a suicidal one politically, but Chen had not entered diplomatic service to play it safe. If they were going down, they would go down swinging. The mood in the room shifted slightly. The Earth delegation still faced an uphill battle, but at least they were united now. Staff members began discussing strategy, debating how to present Charlotte's actions in the best possible light, identifying which delegates might be swayed by different arguments. Someone suggested arranging interviews where Charlotte could explain her reasoning. Another proposed organizing statements of support from palace workers who had witnessed the incident. Charlotte listened to the planning but found her thoughts drifting. She was thinking about Kreshtel, wondering if the young guard would face retaliation for speaking out. She was concerned about the other service workers who had been suffering in silence, hoping that this incident might actually lead to meaningful change for them. She recognized that she had started something that was bigger than just humanity's council membership. The question of how power was wielded and how the powerless were protected had been brought into sharp focus, and it would not be easily dismissed. That evening, Charlotte could not sleep. Her mind kept replaying the day's events, analyzing her choices, wondering if there had been a better way to handle the situation. Around midnight, she received a visitor. Ambassador Sileth of the Kalorn requested a private meeting, and Charlotte agreed immediately. The crystalline being entered her quarters alone, her body casting rainbow patterns on the walls from the room's lighting. Sileth spoke frankly. She told Charlotte that what happened in the garden had been catalytic. Issues that had been simmering beneath the surface of council politics for decades were now being openly discussed. The treatment of service personnel, the immunity enjoyed by powerful delegates, the gap between the council's stated values and actual practices, all of it was suddenly on the table. Multiple species were calling for reforms, using Charlotte's intervention as a rallying point. However, Sileth warned, this also meant that the opposition to human membership had hardened considerably. The Zelnari and their allies saw Charlotte's actions as confirmation of every fear they had expressed about humanity. They were arguing that humans were self-righteous crusaders who would try to impose their values on the rest of the galaxy, disrupting established systems and causing chaos wherever they went. The vote tomorrow would be close, far closer than anyone had predicted a cycle ago. The Kalorn ambassador asked Charlotte a direct question. If she had known that her actions would lead to this situation, would she have acted differently? Would she have walked away from the confrontation to preserve humanity's chances for council membership? It was the question that had been haunting Charlotte all evening, and she found herself answering honestly. She told Sileth that she understood the political calculation. She knew that one guard's suffering weighed very little compared to the potential benefits of council membership for all of humanity. Billions of humans would benefit from access to galactic trade, technology, and diplomatic protection. Those benefits would be denied because Charlotte could not stand by and watch someone being abused. In purely utilitarian terms, her choice made no sense. But humans, Charlotte explained, were not purely utilitarian creatures. Charlotte elaborated that humans had evolved as social animals who survived through cooperation and mutual defense. Deep in their psychology was a drive to protect pack members, even at personal cost. That drive had been refined and expanded over millions of years, shaped by culture and ethics until it extended beyond biological kin to encompass broader concepts of justice and fairness. When humans saw someone being victimized, something ancient and powerful activated in their minds. They simply could not walk away, even when walking away was the rational choice. She admitted that this quality made humans difficult to predict and sometimes dangerous to established systems, but it also meant that humans could be trusted to stand up for others, to fight against injustice even when doing so offered no personal benefit. If the Galactic Council wanted humanity as members, they needed to understand this fundamental aspect of human nature. Humans would not be silent partners who went along with the status quo. They would challenge, question, and push for change when they believed change was needed. Ambassador Sileth's crystalline features seemed to shimmer with something that might have been approval. She told Charlotte that her answer was exactly what the Kalorn had hoped to hear. Sileth explained that the council had indeed become stagnant comfortable and complacent. The elder species had built systems that served their interests and then convinced themselves that these systems represented universal ideals. Younger species learned to work within those systems or remain marginalized. No one had seriously challenged the fundamental assumptions in centuries. The Kalorn ambassador revealed that she and several other delegates from neutral or minor species had been discussing the need for change for years. They recognized that the council was failing to live up to its founding principles, but they lacked the political capital to force reforms. The major powers would simply ignore or suppress their efforts. But humanity, as a candidate species with significant resources and stubborn independence, might be able to accomplish what they could not. Silith stated that Charlotte's actions had demonstrated something crucial. Humans were not seeking council membership because they needed protection or because they wanted to conform to galactic norms. They were seeking membership because they believed they belonged at the table where decisions were made, and they were willing to demand changes to that table if necessary. This made them potentially disruptive, but it also made them potentially transformative. The question facing the council tomorrow was whether they wanted transformation or stability. The crystalline being stood to leave, but before departing, she told Charlotte something significant. Regardless of how the vote went, the princess had already changed the galactic community. The conversations happening across the council right now, the debates about justice and accountability, the willingness of service personnel to speak up about mistreatment, all of it could be traced back to one human who refused to look away from injustice. That legacy would endure regardless of political outcomes. Silith left Charlotte with much to contemplate as the night slowly gave way to morning. The day of the vote arrived with a tension that permeated the entire palace. Charlotte dressed carefully in her formal diplomatic attire, the simple elegance of human design standing in stark contrast to the elaborate garments favored by most alien species. The Earth delegation assembled in their quarters, and Ambassador Chen gave a brief speech about dignity, principle, and acceptance of whatever outcome emerged. They would face the council vote with heads held high, proud of what they stood for even if they ultimately failed to achieve their goal. The council chamber was an architectural marvel, a vast spherical space where delegates from hundreds of species could gather. Seating was arranged in concentric rings rising from a central floor, where speakers addressed the assembly. Advanced technology allowed beings with different atmospheric requirements to participate, with force fields creating customized environments for each species. The lighting shifted and changed to accommodate various visual spectrums, making the chamber appear to shimmer and pulse with otherworldly beauty. Charlotte took her seat in the human delegation section, very aware of the attention focused on her. Some delegates stared openly, others whispered among themselves. The Zelnari delegation, including Ambassador Threll, sat in a prominent position reflecting their status as an elder species. Threll's scales were neutral gray, his expression carefully blank, but Charlotte could feel the waves of hostility emanating from his section. The council speaker, a Vorthian whose species was known for their neutrality and administrative competence, called the session to order. Before proceeding to the vote on human membership, there was an unexpected addition to the agenda. Ambassador Silith had invoked an ancient protocol to bring an emergency matter before the full council. She formally requested an investigation into the treatment of palace service personnel and allegations of abuse by diplomatic staff. She cited the incident involving Ambassador Threll and Guard Crescetel, presenting evidence including Charlotte's recordings and testimony from multiple witnesses. The chamber erupted in noise as dozens of species reacted simultaneously. Some delegates seemed shocked that such a matter would be brought before the full council. Others appeared supportive, nodding or making gestures of agreement. The Zelnari section was a storm of agitated movement, with Threll at the center looking like he might shed his skin from rage. The speaker called for order multiple times before the chamber settled enough for proceedings to continue. Silith presented her case methodically, showing evidence of a pattern of abuse that extended beyond just Threll. She had gathered testimony from service workers across multiple species, demonstrating that mistreatment by powerful diplomats was systemic rather than isolated. She argued that the council could not claim to represent justice and dignity for all sentient beings, while allowing such behavior to continue unchecked. The investigation she proposed would examine not just individual cases, but the structural factors that enabled abuse. Ambassador Threll was given an opportunity to respond. He attempted to frame the situation as a misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by an overzealous human who did not understand galactic norms. He suggested that different species had different interaction styles, and what appeared harsh to humans might be perfectly acceptable to others. He portrayed himself as the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by those who opposed the Zelnari hegemony's legitimate influence, but his defense crumbled when Guard Kreshtel was brought before the council to give testimony. The young Zenth stood before the assembled delegates, his forearms trembling slightly, his compound eyes reflecting the chamber's shifting lights. He spoke clearly despite his obvious fear, describing cycles of escalating abuse, failed attempts to report mistreatment through proper channels, and the suffocating sense that he had no recourse because his abuser was too powerful to challenge. His words were simple, factual, and devastating. Other service personnel came forward as well, emboldened by Kreshtel's courage. A maintenance worker described being struck by a delegate for taking too long to repair an environmental system. A food service provider detailed how a diplomat had deliberately contaminated her workspace with substances toxic to her species because he found her presence annoying. A translator spoke of constant verbal abuse and threats of dismissal if she reported the behavior. The testimonies painted a picture of a culture where those with power felt entitled to mistreat those without it, confident that the system would protect them. The chamber had fallen into stunned silence as the parade of witnesses continued. Many delegates appeared genuinely shocked, as if confronting something they had been successfully ignoring for years. Others looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing their own complicity in maintaining systems that allowed such abuse. A few, particularly among the younger species and those from more egalitarian cultures, showed visible anger at what was being revealed. When the testimonies concluded, Ambassador Sileth called for a vote on whether to launch the investigation. Before the vote could proceed, Charlotte requested permission to address the council. It was unusual for a representative of a candidate species to speak during formal proceedings, but the speaker granted the request given the circumstances. Charlotte stepped down to the central floor, her small human frame seeming almost absurdly tiny in the vast chamber. She spoke without notes, her voice amplified by the chamber's acoustic system so that every being present could hear her clearly. She began by acknowledging that she was not a full member of the council, that humanity was still seeking acceptance, and that she had no official standing to advise the assembly on how to conduct their affairs. But she had been asked by many beings over the past day why she had intervened when it would have been simpler and politically safer to walk away. She wanted to answer that question publicly. Charlotte explained that humans had a complicated and often violent history. They had committed terrible atrocities against each other, building entire systems of oppression and exploitation that persisted for centuries. But throughout that dark history, there were always humans who stood up and said, "This is wrong." There were always humans who put themselves at risk to defend others, who spoke out when silence would have been easier, who challenged power when submission would have been safer. These humans were not always successful, and many paid terrible prices for their courage. But their existence, their willingness to act, slowly bent the arc of human history toward justice. She continued, noting that humans had learned painful lessons from their past. They had learned that evil flourished when good beings did nothing. They had learned that systems of oppression maintained themselves through the silence of those who benefited from them. They had learned that small acts of cruelty, left unchallenged, grew into great atrocities. So humans had built into their culture a principle that sometimes seemed irrational to others. The principle that you stand up for what is right even when it costs you everything. Charlotte looked around the chamber, making eye contact with as many delegates as possible. She stated that the Galactic Council faced a choice today that went beyond the question of human membership. They could vote to investigate the abuse that had been revealed, to hold powerful beings accountable, to reform systems that had failed their most vulnerable members, or they could vote to maintain the status quo, to protect the comfortable arrangements that benefited elder species, to prioritize stability over justice. Whatever they decided would tell humanity everything they needed to know about whether this was a community they wanted to join. She concluded by saying that if the council chose reform, if they chose accountability, if they chose to make their actions match their stated values, then humanity would be proud to join them, regardless of whether the membership vote succeeded today. But if the council chose to protect abusers, to silence victims, to maintain systems of exploitation for the sake of convenience, then humanity would honestly prefer to remain isolated, because joining such a system would mean becoming complicit in it, and humans had promised themselves long ago that they would never again be silent in the face of injustice. Charlotte returned to her seat and the chamber remained quiet for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened. A delegate from the Torvan Confederacy, a species known for their merchant culture and pragmatic politics, stood and requested recognition. He stated that his species had always prioritized stability and profitable relationships over difficult moral questions, but the testimonies today and Princess Charlotte's words had forced him to reconsider what his people truly valued. He announced that the Torvan Confederacy would vote in favor of the investigation and would support reforms to protect service personnel. Several other delegates rose to make similar declarations, a cascade of support building across the chamber. The vote on launching the investigation passed overwhelmingly, with even some of the Zelnari allies declining to oppose it. Ambassador Threll sat rigid and silent as the council formally authorized a comprehensive review of diplomatic conduct and service personnel treatment. Selith was appointed to lead the investigation, given broad authority to recommend reforms and sanctions. It was a stunning reversal of the normal pattern of council politics, where controversial matters were typically buried in committee or delayed indefinitely. Then came the vote that everyone had been anticipating. The question of humanity's membership in the Galactic Council. The speaker outlined the standard procedures, noting that admission required approval from 2/3 of current member species. The tally would be displayed publicly, with each species' vote recorded for posterity. Ambassador Chen gripped the armrests of his chair tightly, and Charlotte found herself holding her breath despite trying to maintain diplomatic composure. The voting proceeded by seniority, with the eldest species casting their ballots first. As expected, the Zelnari voted against admission, their opposition now personal as well as political. Several of their traditional allies followed suit. But then came surprises. The Korvax voted in favor, citing humanity's demonstrated honor. The Maranu Collective voted in favor, noting humanity's commitment to social justice. Species that had been expected to abstain or vote against admission instead cast their support for Earth. The tally climbed higher than anyone had predicted. When the final votes were counted, humanity's admission passed with 71% approval, well above the required threshold. The Earth delegation erupted in celebration, decades of work finally bearing fruit. Ambassador Chen was openly weeping, and junior diplomats were hugging each other with joy. Charlotte sat quietly for a moment, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Humanity had not just gained council membership. They had helped spark a movement for reform that would ripple through galactic society for generations, and it had all started with refusing to walk past a guard being mistreated. As the celebration continued around her, Charlotte's eyes found Crescitel in the section reserved for palace staff who had given testimony. The young Zenth's compound eyes met hers across the vast chamber, and he raised his forearms in a gesture of gratitude and respect. Charlotte smiled and returned the gesture, knowing that whatever political victories had been won today, the most important achievement was far simpler. They had stood together against injustice and they had refused to be silent. That, more than any treaty or membership, was what defined true civilization.